Chapter 1: Discovery and Curiosity. The afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the archaeological site, deep in the heart of Peru. Alex Carter, a seasoned but often underappreciated historian, brushed dirt from his gloves and squatted by a shallow trench. He was examining a small tattered book, an old worn diary with faded ink on its fragile pages. His heartbeat quickened as he traced the symbols scattered across the pages. These weren't random, they matched a pattern he'd seen only once before. Years earlier, Alex had stumbled upon an obscure fragment of a map drawn by an explorer who disappeared in the early 1900s. This diary seemed to reference the same symbols as that mysterious map, a set of glyphs rumored to lead to a forgotten civilization somewhere in the depths of the Amazon. As he flipped through the pages, Alex's eyes lit up with excitement. The diary mentioned a place called the Temple of Echoes, a sacred site said to hold treasures of forbidden knowledge. Alex's fingers trembled as he read, "To uncover the truth is to open a door that cannot be closed. Beyond this threshold lies madness." That warning would have scared off a wiser man, but to Alex, it was an invitation. This was his chance to make the discovery of a lifetime, one that would cement his name in history. He had always felt he was destined for something greater than cataloging artifacts in dusty museums, and this diary felt like a calling. That evening, he returned to his tent, where the soft glow of a lantern illuminated the yellowed pages. He spent hours poring over every symbol and note, mapping out what he could decipher. He could almost see the temple, hidden within the dense canopy of the Amazon, waiting for him to unveil its secrets. Little did he know, the journey ahead would challenge not only his courage, but his very grip on reality. Chapter 2: Journey to the Amazon. A week later, Alex and his small team stood at the edge of the Amazon, looking out at a sea of towering trees and dense vegetation that stretched as far as the eye could see. Beside him were Lisa, his adventurous friend, who had an unquenchable thirst for adrenaline; Marco, a local guide with knowledge of the terrain; and Dr. Thomason, an anthropologist with a cautious demeanor and a deep respect for indigenous cultures. They packed light, but prepared for the unknown. Compasses, machetes, tents, and enough food to last them several weeks. The air was thick with humidity, buzzing with the sounds of insects and the calls of unseen creatures. Alex felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. He knew this journey would change him, though he couldn't yet fathom how. As they ventured deeper, Marco shared stories of ancient tribes who worshipped gods of the jungle and practiced rites to appease spirits. Lisa, ever skeptical, rolled her eyes, but listened intently. Alex, however, felt a strange connection to the tales, as if he were stepping into a world where these myths and legends were real. That first night, they set up camp by a small river. After dinner, they gathered around the fire, listening to the jungle sounds that enveloped them. As the flames flickered, Marco warned them about the cursed zone further ahead, a place where even the bravest locals refused to go. "Ghosts, they say," he murmured in his thick accent. "People go in, but they don't come out. Some say they hear voices, others see shadows in the trees. It is not a place for the living." Lisa chuckled, trying to lighten the mood, but Alex noticed the unease in her eyes. The jungle, with its shifting shadows and haunting sounds, seemed to be watching them. When they finally drifted to sleep, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, just beyond the firelight. Chapter 3: Entering the Forbidden Zone. 2 days later, the team reached a narrow trail leading off their mapped route. The path was overgrown and almost invisible, but it matched the diary's description. Alex's heart pounded as they crossed an invisible line into what Marco called the Forbidden Zone. Immediately, the atmosphere seemed to change. The jungle here was darker, the trees thicker, as if they were trying to keep the sunlight out. The air was colder, the silence oppressive. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing here. Every step felt heavy, the ground damp and soft beneath their boots. The diary's warnings echoed in Alex's mind, but he pushed on, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. After an hour of trekking, they stumbled upon an abandoned village. The wooden huts, long decayed and overgrown with moss, were arranged in a circle, with strange totems marking the center. The totems were carved with grotesque faces, twisted in expressions of terror and pain. Their eyes seemed to follow the team as they moved, filling the air with an unspoken terror. Dr. Thomason examined one closely and muttered, "These are warnings." The people here must have left in a hurry. As they explored, a strange feeling washed over Alex, a sense of déjà vu, as if he'd seen this place before. He found a small, weathered chart lying, with a symbol etched into it that matched those in the diary. He picked it up, and a chill ran down his spine. That night, they camped just outside the village, too unnerved to stay within its boundaries. As they lay in their tents, the jungle around them felt alive with invisible eyes. Alex tried to sleep, but his mind kept returning to the faces on the totems, their silent screams haunting his thoughts. In the dead of night, Alex awoke to a faint whisper. It was a voice he didn't recognize, soft and distant, like the echo of a memory. "Leave, or be claimed," it seemed to say. He bolted upright, but there was no one there. Only the trees, their branches swaying in a non-existent breeze. He lay back down, heart racing, wondering if he'd just imagined it. But the jungle had other plans. Chapter 4. First Encounter. The next morning, the group was tense and silent as they packed up. The night had left them all on edge, and even Lisa, usually lighthearted, was unusually quiet. They continued deeper into the jungle, where the diary hinted at the location of the temple. By midday, they came across an ancient stone path, barely visible beneath years of moss and vines. Following it, they arrived at an eerie clearing filled with overgrown statues. The statues depicted monstrous figures, beings with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing as silent sentinels guarding an invisible. Marco shivered, whispering, "These are not gods. They are something else, something dark." Ignoring these things, Alex pressed forward, but every step felt heavier, the air thicker, as if an invisible force were pushing back. The team's footsteps grew slower, and the silence around them intensified, an oppressive weight that seemed to sink into their bones. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Alex saw a figure moving in the trees, a shadowy silhouette that flickered in and out of sight. He turned, but it vanished. Lisa gasped. Did anyone else see that? They stood frozen, listening. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the jungle, high-pitched and cut off abruptly. They rushed toward the sound, to find nothing. No sign of anyone, no animal tracks, just an empty space where the scream had come from. As they turned back, they realized one of their team members, Danny, was missing. They searched frantically, calling his name, but there was no response. Only an eerie silence and the faint rustle of leaves, as if the jungle itself had swallowed him whole. Shaken, they made camp close to the path. The shadows lengthened, the statues around them seeming to grow taller, watching with empty eyes. They huddled close that night, haunted by the scream that had led them to nothing but darkness. Chapter 5. The Temple of Echoes. By dawn, Alex and his remaining team were exhausted, but their resolve remained firm. Despite the fear that clung to them like the humidity, they followed the path to what they hoped would be the Temple of Echoes. Alex led the way, gripping the ancient charm he'd found in the abandoned village, as if it might somehow protect him. They soon arrived at the temple, a towering structure half buried in vines and moss, its stone walls etched with the same grotesque faces they had seen on the totems. The temple's architecture was otherworldly, with angles that seemed impossible, like the builders had defied nature itself. Despite its age, the structure felt alive, as though it were breathing along with the jungle. As they approached, Dr. Thomason murmured, "This place, it was never meant to be found." Ignoring his hesitation, Alex stepped through the entrance, feeling an almost magnetic pull from within. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Strange carvings lined the hallways depicting a series of rituals involving human figures kneeling before monstrous idols. Lisa, her voice barely above a whisper, said, "These people, they worship something dark." Their exploration led them to the central chamber, where a massive stone altar stood. The air was icy cold, and as they neared the altar, they noticed dried bloodstains on its surface. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Suddenly, a whisper echoed through the chamber, filling their minds rather than their ears. "Welcome, welcome." The voice seemed ancient, both soothing and terrifying. Alex gripped his head, trying to block it out, but the whispers grew louder, as if the temple itself were speaking to him, welcoming him into its dark embrace. Chapter 6. The Descent. Alex shook himself free of the whispers, but he could tell the others were rattled. After regaining their composure, they discovered a narrow staircase leading down, spiraling into the depths of the temple. The air grew colder and more stale as they descended, and an unsettling sense of dread settled over them. The stairs opened up into a labyrinth of tunnels, each lined with statues that appeared to be watching them with hollow eyes. Alex could feel his pulse quickening, his breath shallow. Every now and then he would glance back, feeling as though something were trailing them, just beyond the edge of their flashlight's glow. The tunnels twisted and turned, and soon they realized they were hopelessly lost. The walls seemed to shift when they weren't looking, as though the temple were alive, trapping them in its bowels. Dr. Thomason's voice trembled. I think this place is trying to keep us here." Their flashlights began to flicker, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Alex saw a figure in the darkness, a shadowy form that looked almost human, but twisted and unnatural. He backed away, heart pounding. The figure vanished, leaving only a lingering cold. Lisa gripped his arm, whispering, "Did you see that? I swear, it looked like Danny." They continued forward, haunted by glimpses of figures in the shadows, each one more disturbing than the last. The further they went, the more the air felt thick with something indescribable, a presence that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Chapter 7. Trapped in Time. As they ventured deeper, Alex began experiencing strange visions. He would blink and suddenly see scenes from a different time, people dressed in ancient robes, performing rituals around the altar. He saw faces twisted in horror, eyes wide as they were led toward the altar, chanting words he couldn't understand. The visions became more intense, and he could feel them bleeding into reality. His team members noticed his disorientation, and Dr. Thomason pulled him aside. "Alex, this place, it's affecting you. You need to get out of here." But Alex was too far gone, too drawn to the knowledge he believed lay within the temple. He couldn't leave now, not when he was so close. He became obsessed with the diary's predictions, realizing that each entry seemed to describe events that were happening to them. The diary spoke of sacrifices, of rituals meant to appease the spirits within the temple, and it warned that any who entered without permission would be claimed by the temple itself. Meanwhile, Lisa and Dr. Thomason began hearing whispers calling their names, as if the temple knew them. They were all starting to feel as though they'd been here before, as if they were trapped in a cycle, reliving the same moments over and over. One night, as they tried to rest in a small chamber, the walls seemed to close in, pulsating with energy. Alex began to feel a sensation of suffocation, as if he were drowning in the memories of those who had come before. He saw them, explorers from decades past, villagers from the ancient civilization, all reliving their final moments within the temple's walls. Chapter 8. Uncovering the Horror. The following day, they stumbled upon a hidden chamber deep within the temple, a place that seemed untouched by time. The air was thick with a stench of decay, and the room was filled with skeletal remains, arranged in positions of prayer or surrender. At the center of the chamber lay a massive stone sarcophagus, carved with symbols of fearsome gods. Alex approached it, feeling a compulsion he couldn't resist. As his fingers traced the lid, he felt a jolt of energy, a surge of memories flooding his mind. The ancient civilization had made a pact with dark entities, spirits that demanded blood in exchange for power. This temple was built as a place of worship, but it became a prison, a place to contain the horrors they had unleashed. Suddenly, the shadows began to gather, taking on human shapes, the spirits of those sacrificed here, trapped within the temple. They reached out with twisted hands, their faces contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Lisa screamed, backing away, but the apparitions began closing in. Dr. Thomason, frozen in terror, could only watch as one of the shadows reached out, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. The spirits seemed drawn to Alex, surrounding him as he stood by the sarcophagus, unable to move. In that moment, Alex understood the truth. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was a trap, a cage for the dark entities and the souls of the sacrificed, all bound to the curse placed upon this ground. Desperate to escape, the team backed toward the entrance, but the shadows followed, filling the chamber. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the tunnels, merging into a deafening roar. Alex could feel the temple pulling him in, as if it wanted to claim him, to make him part of its horrific collection of souls. With one final push of willpower, Alex broke free, dragging his friends with him as they fled back through the labyrinthine tunnels. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows reaching out, clawing at them as they stumbled upward, finally bursting out into the daylight. They ran until they could no longer hear the whispers, their bodies exhausted, their minds haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. As they looked back at the temple, Alex realized he would never be free from its curse. The temple had marked him, and the darkness within him would follow him for the rest of his life. Chapter 9. Escape or embrace the curse. The relief of escaping the temple was short-lived. As Alex, Lisa, and Dr. Thomason stumbled through the jungle, the oppressive silence weighed on them, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. They had barely escaped the shadows within the temple, but they could still feel its presence, like a dark cloud looming over them. The air grew thick, and every step felt heavier, as though the jungle were pulling them back. They were exhausted, both mentally and physically, and they had little food and water left. Night was falling, and the jungle was alive with strange sounds, whispers, footsteps that matched their own, rustling leaves, and distant echoing screams. As they set up a small camp, Lisa spoke up, her voice filled with fear and frustration. "Alex, I don't think we can escape. That thing inside the temple, whatever it is, it marked us. I feel it in my mind, my skin. I can't shake it." Alex didn't want to admit it, but he felt it too. The temple had left a dark stain on his soul, something he couldn't wash away. The shadows seemed to follow them, whispering promises and threats. The diary he'd found, now mysteriously blank, lay in his pack, a constant reminder of the knowledge he'd uncovered and the curse he'd unleashed. That night, he awoke to find himself standing at the edge of the camp, staring back in the direction of the temple. In his mind, he could hear it calling to him, inviting him back to finish what he'd started. He could feel its ancient hunger, a darkness that wanted to consume him, to make him part of its horrific legacy. When he returned to the camp, he found Dr. Thomason missing. In a panic, he woke Lisa, and together they searched the nearby jungle. They called his name, their voices swallowed by the dense, silent air. Then they heard a faint chanting, a voice that sounded like Dr. Thomason's, coming from deeper in the trees. They followed the voice until they found him standing in a clearing, his face blank, his eyes staring into the distance as he muttered words in a language neither of them understood.
His voice was flat, mechanical, as if he were reciting a mantra. Suddenly, Dr. Thomason's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. Alex and Lisa rushed to his side, but it was too late. He had no pulse, his face frozen in terror. It was as if something had taken hold of him, used him, and then discarded him. Shaken and terrified, Alex and Lisa knew they had to keep moving, or they too would fall under the temple's influence. But the jungle seemed endless, and every path felt like a loop, leading them back to where they started. It was as if the temple's power had extended beyond its walls, trapping them in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Chapter 10 Returning Changed. After days of wandering, Alex and Lisa finally broke through the dense jungle and stumbled upon a remote village at the edge of civilization. Exhausted and half delirious, they were taken in by the villagers, who treated their wounds and gave them food and water. The villagers looked at them with a mixture of fear and pity, as if they recognized something dark lingering around them. As Alex recovered, he couldn't shake the memories of the temple. It haunted him, filling his dreams with twisted images of the rituals, the shadows, and the faces of those who had been sacrificed. He tried to forget, but the temple's mark was etched into his mind, a dark presence that refused to fade. Lisa, too, was changed. She had once been vibrant and fearless, but now she was haunted, her eyes hollow and distant. She spoke less, and when she did, her voice was filled with a quiet despair. They both knew they had left a part of themselves behind in the temple, and in return, the temple had left a piece of itself within them. When they finally returned to their home countries, they attempted to move on, but the memories followed them like a shadow. Alex tried to resume his work, but he found himself obsessing over the diary and the symbols he had seen in the temple. He spent hours researching ancient curses and forbidden rituals, hoping to understand what had happened to him, and perhaps find a way to rid himself of the temple's influence. But the more he learned, the deeper he fell into madness. The shadows that had haunted him in the jungle began appearing in his home. He would see them in mirrors, in the corners of his rooms, always watching, waiting. The whispers returned, growing louder each night, calling him back to the temple. Lisa reached out to him once, desperate and terrified, saying she too was experiencing the same nightmares and visions. They both realized the temple's mark was permanent, a curse that bound them together in their suffering. One night, unable to bear the whispers any longer, Alex opened the diary. The once blank pages were now filled with new writing, entries describing his every movement, his descent into madness, as if the temple were recording his life even from afar. The final entry was a command, scrawled in blood-red ink, *, return. Complete the ritual, only then will you be free. With a heavy heart and a fractured mind, Alex knew what he had to do. He packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to the few friends he had left, and booked a one-way ticket back to the Amazon. As he boarded the plane, he glanced at his reflection in the window, and for a moment, he saw a shadowy figure staring back at him, his own face twisted into the hollow-eyed expression of the temple's statues. Lisa, too, made her way back to the jungle, drawn by the same compulsion. They both knew they would never truly be free of the temple's influence, but perhaps, by returning, they could finally find peace.